Thank you for listening and supporting the Daily Memphian. Sign up for one of our many free newsletters and breaking news alerts at dailymemphian.com/email to receive the latest local news stories impacting our community. Our weekly newsletters cover everything from sports to arts and culture, business, food, and more, along with daily updates of all the news we publish each day. Sign up or manage your email preferences at dailymemphian.com/email.
This is the Daily Memphian Politics Podcast. I'm Bill Dries. The main event, author and historian Paula Giddings on Ida B. Wells and the new statue of Wells going up at 4th and Beale 129 years after she left the city in exile. Top of the podcast, the Tennessee Health Department no longer promoting any kind of childhood vaccinations, including vaccinations for the COVID virus. Health Department leaders folded the tent on getting the word out about the vaccinations and immunizations, and even removed the state logo from brochures and online reminders after Republican state legislators were vocal in objecting to the vaccination campaign, questioning if this can and should be able to be done without the approval of parents, and some legislators talking of dissolving the state health department. That was followed by the state firing the head of the immunization program for all of Tennessee, Dr. Michelle Fiskus, who then said her firing was the administration of Tennessee Governor Bill Lee placating Republicans in the legislature. She termed it reprehensible. Meanwhile, the Shelby County Health Department will continue to promote all vaccinations and immunizations, including COVID for children, because it's one of the metro health departments that call their own shots on such matters. But those efforts rely on state funding, including printing of the materials to be distributed and some kind of coordination with the state, so that the state and local health department seem to be singing from the same hymn book, so to speak. New Memphis Police Chief C.J. Davis at the White House this past week with some other big city chiefs and mayors to talk about the summer surge of violent crime. President Joe Biden doubling down on a federal response that includes hiring more cops, but also emphasizes community policing and specifically violence intervention programs like the one the administration of Mayor Jim Strickland is in the process of standing up outside the MPD. Biden saying the effort will require cooperation among local, state, and federal governments on the best use of federal American Rescue Plan Act funding for those purposes. Before the meeting, Republican U.S. Senator Marsha Blackburn of Tennessee tweeting a reference to Hunter Biden, asking if he was part of the meeting and sarcastically referring to the president's son as an expert on rising crime. Blackburn, in tweets before and after the session, has continually referred to the surge in violent crime as a problem of cities with blue or Democratic leadership and blaming the crime surges on calls to defund police. The day after the White House meeting, Chief Davis saying at a Southern Christian Leadership Conference meeting with the Baptist Ministerial Association that she wants to use federal funding for more cops and overtime pay, that as well as some type of public campaign on gun violence specifically. Memphis Mayor Jim Strickland says look for more details on how the city spends ARPA money during July 20th City Council committee sessions. It might come then or further down the road, but City Council member Martavius Jones is working on a proposed city charter amendment for the 2022 election year that would change the city charter to allow for partisan primary elections for mayor and the council. The local primaries have been a fact of life in county elections here since 1992. The irony is the push for Democratic and Republican primaries in local politics here began with Democrats in the mid-1980s as Republicans watched the ensuing brawl from the sidelines. Then Congressman Harold Ford Sr., who favored primaries, squaring off with the local Democratic Party faction led by Bill Ferris and others who thought local elections should remain nonpartisan. Ultimately, the Democrats' decision was no, and once it was settled, Republicans popped up with a much less rancorous discussion that led to the county primaries. Less rancorous being a relative term since it originally included judges who were none too happy As a result, their offices were soon after made an exception to the primaries, some grumbling among non-judicial incumbents in county government forced to pick a party, most of them ultimately picking Republican. Jones has argued as recently as late last year in the race for council chairman among the 13 council members that Democrats should rally round the party as a response to Republicans on the body already doing that despite the lack of formal party designations. The other side of that is a formal 8-5 partisan split on the Shelby County Commission, with Democrats having the majority. That, as well as a Democratic county mayor and every other countywide office in the blue column. None of that has resulted in a unified front on a set or slate of issues set out ahead of time that many of those in the majority party at the county building had hoped for. CPAC, the Conservative Political Action Conference of the American Conservative Union in Dallas, with the state's 2 Republican senators, Marsha Blackburn and Bill Hagerty, on the speakers list as they have been at past CPACs, including ones held here in Memphis. Blackburn's speech was all China, calling for a hard line on China and portraying Democrats on the whole as taking guidance from China's communist leaders and appeasing them. You're either against China or with China by that standard. Blackburn also calling for recognizing Taiwan as an independent nation, something Republican as well as Democratic presidential administrations have rigorously avoided doing, while still pledging allegiance to the doctrine of defending Taiwan against any military action or invasion by the People's Republic. Blackburn is not the first conservative Republican senator from Tennessee to make China an issue. The late Fred Thompson spent a major part of his tenure in the Senate and much of his 4-month bid for the Republican presidential nomination after that, making China a centerpiece of his rhetoric. The difference here is Thompson made a distinction that U.S. policy toward China should be about what is in the best interest of the U.S. and not necessarily about communism. Thompson, at that time, mid-1990s to 3 years into the 21st century, did not see China as seeking world domination for its brand of communism. He saw China's leadership as all about remaining in power there being Hong Kong as well by then. He thought Taiwan should not declare independence, Thompson also calling for a balance of drawing lines and finding agreements, something that by Blackburn's comments there is no place for. The world context admittedly is different. Thompson, at times, was speaking in the wake of the 9/11 terrorist attacks as the U.S. was about to go to war in Afghanistan and Iraq. China began building artificial islands in the South China Sea as strategic military installations in 2014, and in Thompson's time, China's leadership was an unsettled question. 6 years after Thompson's death, the world's most populous nation, and all that means for business, the environment, ideological competition, and the ideological balance is still complex, even if it's a different complexity. Joining us now is Paula Giddings, the author of Ida B. Wells, A Sword Among Lions, the 2008 biography of the activist, civil rights pioneer, and Memphian, hailed as the definitive biography of Wells. She is the Elizabeth A. Woodson Professor Emerita of Africana Studies at Smith College. A Sword Among Lions was a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award and won the Los Angeles Times Book Prize for biography. We talk with Professor Giddings the same week that a statue of Ida B. Wells is to be unveiled by First Baptist Church on Beale at the corner of 4th and Beale. Professor Giddings, let's get right to the occasion. Your thoughts on a statue of Ida B. Wells in Memphis 129 years after she left. And for further context, this comes just weeks after the remains of Confederate general, slave trader, and Ku Klux Klan Grand Wizard Nathan Bedford Forrest were disinterred from a park here once named in his honor.
Well, thank you. Well, first of all, it's very nice to be on your program, and thank you for doing this program. It's so important. I remember coming to Memphis years ago, and this was an issue then as well. It was the statue of Forrest, and the community wanting to replace it. To have a statue of Ida B. Wells. So the first thing I'd like to do is to commend those who have been working so hard for years and years and years to make this a reality. And it just shows that we can do these things if we mobilize and if we are persistent. So that's my first thing, is to congratulate them.
Right. And you were here in 2012. And at that time you said, hey, this is something that the city needs to do.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly. Yes. So yes, the other aspect of it, you know, when you have these commemorative statues, I mean, what you're doing is asking yourself, well, who are we? What kind of city is Memphis really the city? Do we want Nathan Forrest to be the face of Memphis? Gracious goodness. Or someone like Ida B. Wells, you know, who is working for the Constitution, who's trying to free everyone, who is for equity, et cetera. And the other thing about Forrest, of course, is that, I mean, he wasn't only one of the founders of the Ku Klux Klan. He not only enslaved people, but he wasn't even an honorable Confederate soldier. Everyone who knows the story of the Fort Pillow massacre, where hundreds of soldiers, hundreds of Black soldiers were bayoneted and shot to death after surrendering. I mean, what kind of man is this? He has so much blood on his hands. And now, thank goodness, now the city of Memphis has washed some of that blood off.
Mm-hmm. The statue of Ida B. Wells is on the corner by First Baptist Church on Beale Street, as we mentioned, in what is now Robert Church Park. How important and central was this area to Wells during her time in Memphis?
Well, of course, her newspaper office was on Beale Street. And now, Bill, you have to help me out. I'm not sure. Is the First Baptist Church the same as the Beale Street Church?
Yes.
Well, the Beale Street Church is absolutely essential. Of course, the newspaper was actually published in the basement of the Beale Street Church for a number of years. And its minister at the time of Ida in Memphis was Taylor Nightingale, who was the first co-owner, along with Ida and J.L. Fleming, of the Free Speech newspaper. Right. And Nightingale is a figure, you know, we do need to know more about some of these figures that don't emerge in the history so easily. But someone like Taylor Nightingale, who was such a militant and important figure in Memphis in this period of time. And of course, if you read anything of what the Free Speech published in this period, it was very militant, very radical. And he is an important reason why. You know, it is said that he was the only minister who possessed a repeating rifle. Mm-hmm. You know, at one point he took, affidavits from people who were talking about voter fraud in Memphis and sending them to the Republican administration. And he was also one of the people who really talks and articulates the kind of transformation in the Reconstruction period of Blacks who are really willing now, as he said, you know, the old Negro who shuffled, et cetera, and took orders is gone. He said, there's a new Negro now in this period. And so he was very important and an important influence on Ida Wells as well. But that church, of course, in Beale Street is just at the, which was also the center of the Black community, but was also the center of the newspaper and of militant expression in Black Memphis.
Mm-hmm. And it's important to remember, and you brought this up with the tone of this. How different was the journalism of her time from the journalism of today? And I don't mean just with the free speech newspaper. I mean, on the other side of this too, with newspapers like the Commercial, on the white side of the community.
It's a very interesting period because this is at the turn of the century. There is new technology that allows papers to be published, to be printed very quickly, to be nationally distributed. And so their content becomes very, very important. And also they could publish them a little more cheaply. And so we see in a city like Memphis, where there are at least 3 major white newspapers, two black newspapers, and those numbers would change a little bit in different years. As a result of the competition, it reminds me a little bit of the right, in terms of the white press, the right wing media now, which competes to get the attention of a certain constituency, and as a result, sometimes they could be very salacious and could talk about conspiracy theories, et cetera, and we see this in this white press of the period. What the connection to lynching is it has many prongs, but one of them is there's a journalist, Jacqueline Dowd Hall, calls the reporting of lynching in the newspapers, it was like folk pornography. It was very explicit. The sense of horror is very much conveyed in the press, and they're really sort of competing with one another to get the attention of not only for ideological reasons, but also for commercial reasons of a particular constituency in the community. So we see some of those parallels, some of those parallels there, great deal of sensationalism, et cetera. What you also see is, and what Wells is really the first to pick up and able to articulate, is that people tended at that point, before then, to kind of believe what the press says, right? It's printed matter. You tend to believe, but Wells points out that and there's an article she writes called "The Lying White Press," a section of her anti-lynching editorial, where the press is actually criminalizing upstanding Black citizens and setting them up to be killed, really, as a result of that. Mm-hmm. And she's the one who begins to understand that there's a narrative, that they're creating kind of a narrative myth of the dangerous, in those days you'd say the dangerous Negro, right? And this was setting up Blacks to get killed quite easily, and of course without extra legally as well. And she really points to that, and tries in her own writing tries to is also a corrective to that.
Right. Yeah, but because she finds out about this horrible lynching of 3 men who were part of the ownership of the People's Grocery. Thomas Moss, one of them, who she knew quite well. I believe you're right that she was actually the godmother of his daughter.
That's right.
So she reads about this, and of course she's reading the quote unquote white newspapers as well, and sees the coverage of this happening in advance.
That's right.
It's really hard to imagine this today, but if you go back and read these accounts, you discover there are press accounts saying this will happen at such and such a time, identifying no one in the crowd when there are thousands of people present. So she reads this, she knows this has happened, she's even grieving about it. And so when she puts pen to paper and with the idea that this is going to go into print, she gives as good as she got. Really.
That's right. That's right. Mm-hmm. That's right. And to think of one of the things that's, of course, so compelling about her is this kind of bravery that she has. And, these kind of people who, emerge, not too many of them, but emerge from time to time, who are just so driven and who just never look to the left or to the right. They do it because they have to do something because it's the right thing to do, no matter what the consequences are. And for her to step forward and to really, one of the things that she needs to be credited more for, too, is that she really becomes, as a result of this lynching that you mentioned, an investigative journalist, not just a journalist who writes opinions and who writes stories, but she actually becomes an investigative journalist, investigating the circumstances around lynchings that she can report to her readers.
Mm-hmm. And after reading your book, the reaction to what she writes in the first instance, under the pen name Iola, the reaction to this, which included the trashing of the newspaper office, its destruction, and a warning that if the paper publishes again, that there will be more violence and more intense violence. That reaction from elements in the Memphis community was much more thought out than just an angry mob outraged by what they read from Iola.
Exactly. And of course, what the rationale for lynching in this period, which was a rise in lynching. Lynching had certainly taken place, certainly since lynching actually starts in the Revolutionary War period, where whites were being lynched, but that's a whole nother story. It becomes racialized during Reconstruction. And one of the rationales for lynching Black people, of course, and Black men and women, but particularly for Black men, was that Black men were raping, were raping suddenly, raping white women. And this was the kind of, in a Victorian period, this was the kind of crime that excused extrajudicial justice like lynching, right? People would say, well, maybe it's wrong because it's outside the law, but people would be so enraged by the idea of a rape that it kind of justified a lynching. And so one of the things Wells realizes, because of the circumstances around those lynchings that you mentioned in Memphis, where there was no rape, there was no criminality. What it was in the end was these men who owned the grocery, including Thomas Moss, were competing successfully with whites. And she begins to understand that lynching is not about this, this sudden emergence of bestiality on the part of Black men, right? Mm-hmm. But it's really about a lot about economic competition and about keeping Blacks in their place. The South has to figure out how to deal with these bodies that are free now, and so this is a very important period of how they're going to deal with it, and the decision obviously is that they're going to keep Blacks in their place and keep them down and repressed and oppressed, no matter what it takes to do it. Mm-hmm. So she begins. So as you say, to go back to your point, these the mob violence and riots and lynchings, individual and group lynchings, are not affairs of. In fact, and she calls us out. She says, people like to say it's just a sudden rage that overtakes people, but it's not at all. It's really a concerted effort to keep Blacks down and to show examples to keep other Blacks down, the individuals. Mm-hmm.
So when the newspaper office was ransacked, she had already planned on being out of town, and she was out of town when this happened. And you're right. Initially, she had some thoughts about coming back here in what was a very charged environment. Did she have any thoughts of returning later in her life?
She did return later.
Okay.
Yes, she did return briefly. Oh gosh, I believe the year is 1920, some years afterward, to work with some of the political entities in Memphis at the time briefly. And she gave a speech there, but she didn't stay there. She was really on her way somewhere else and stopped in Memphis. But she did. I wish, as far as I know, she really did write about her feelings about coming back to Memphis for the first time, and actually coming back to the South for the first time, since she had been threatened with lynching after the famous editorial that preceded her newspaper office being ransacked.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that's a very interesting observation, but because her personality to me is just fascinating, and your book provides a great glimpse into that. So does the Memphis Diary, which was edited and annotated by Miriam DaCosta Willis, who died recently. It deals some with the railroad case that she won while here, but is overall, I think, a pretty fascinating look at how she waded into the fabric of Memphis. She attended several church services on a Sunday and was very interested in what was being said from the pulpit, what was being said in the pews, what we would today call networking extensively as she went about her day in the city, and so many opinions about the people she encountered, good and bad. Did she intend for us to see these notes, or were these notes to herself? And what did you pick up from her about her from the diary?
Yes, I very much doubt that she thought that the diary would ever become public. And it's so important, that diary, because as far as we know, it's the only kind of eyewitness account of a community in this period of time. And so you really get a sense that diary was so important to my own biography, because you really get a sense of the community life, at least from one person's perspective, in Reconstruction and immediate post-Reconstruction Memphis. One of the things that was very important as well was that in a diary you hear the voice. You know what the voice is, because it is a private voice. It's not a voice that is used for public consumption necessarily. And so you get a sense of her interior, of who she was from that diary. And one of the most fascinating things was Ida Wells was a self-reflective person, and she knew, for example, as a result of, many of us know the story, that she was orphaned at an early age and felt betrayed by her community in Holly Springs, Mississippi, at an early age, and was as a result of that, had a lot of anger inside of her, and she knew she called her anger in that diary her besetting sin. Mm-hmm. She was so angry. She understood that if she didn't do something about it, it would destroy her. And so she sets about, and you can trace this in the diary. It's subtle. You have to trace it, but you can trace her tremendous efforts to turn this and transform this anger into something positive. And it's transformed into her sense of reform and activism. That's part of the engine that is, and she's a driven person, and that's part of the engine that's driving this. Is this a new kind of combustion, of turning it into something else that's positive. And by the way, that is a psychological element of lots of people who are leaders and who do kind of extraordinary kinds of things. It's a transformation of one strong emotion into another.
And it endures to this day, because Ida B. Wells is a figure that a new generation of activists here in Memphis have identified with and named as an influence, an outspoken woman who died long before even some of the activists today who take her as an example, even before their parents were born in some cases. What is there about her that is particularly relatable in the times that we find ourselves in?
I think, Bill, the one of the most proud, maybe the most outstanding thing is her always telling truth to power. We hear that phrase a lot, but she really did it. Truth to power, no matter how difficult it was. I say at one point in the biography, she follows, once she figures out what lynching is really about, she follows the logic of lynching no matter where it leads her. And it leads her to discourses around sexuality that nobody's talking about. It leads, beyond the physical courage it takes. At one point, as you know, she buys a pistol and she says, well, they're probably going to come after me, but I'm going to take one person with me. So there's that physical courage. Mm-hmm. But she also has a courage of conviction that she's going to follow the path that she thinks she needs to follow no matter what happens. And as you know, she's called all kinds of names by the white press. Her own morality is challenged all the time. Lots of Black conservatives can't stand her because she's always stirring up the status quo and causing new challenges. So I think that's one thing, and we just don't have very many people who are just willing to do that, no matter what it means to your career, to your finances, to your marriage in some cases, to your mother as a mother to your child. No matter what it is, it might have to fall by the wayside. You're going to follow that conviction. I think I'm certainly hungry for those kind of people. The other thing is that she is really, in many ways, the originator of an idea around Black Lives Matter, because for much of the country, and even for some elite Blacks, certain Black lives didn't matter as much as others. Right? There was a sense of yes, lynching is terrible and it's against the law and all. But, if you just lived as a good American citizen, that inevitably you were going to get your, first-class citizenship rights, and you weren't going to be vulnerable to these kinds of things happening. Booker T. Washington, he used to drive Ida Wells crazy. Booker T. Washington, the head of Tuskegee, in the period, used to say, he said, no graduate of Tuskegee ever got lynched, as if your certain kinds of behavior would make you immune from racism. Mm-hmm. And she is the one that understands that this is absolutely not true.
Right.
There's a very different social contract that's going on. And she also, but in the meantime, she humanizes the victims. She writes about them, who they were, what their communities thought about them. Very much of what we've seen around the George Floyd. We know a lot about him. We understand that we think more fully about who these people are in our communities who are victimized. And she's the one who begins doing that in the press.
Absolutely. Our time has come to an end. The clock is ticking down here on our Zoom feed. So I want to thank you for being here. Paula Giddings is the author of Ida B. Wells, A Sword Among Lions. On WKNO's Behind the Headlines this week, a reporters roundtable with Abigail Warren of the Daily Memphian. Lots to talk and run down, including the pandemic's possible comeback, a visit to the White House for the city's new police chief, and the pipeline aftermath, as well as Tennessee's 2 Republican senators at CPAC and a firing at the state health department. You can also hear the show on our Behind the Headlines podcast. Subscribe to the Daily Memphian at dailymemphian.com. Subscribe to this podcast and our others at Google Play, iTunes, Spotify, and Stitcher. I'm Bill Dries. The Daily Memphian Politics Podcast is produced by Natalie Van Gundy.
In-depth journalism in the Memphis community, the Daily Memphian is of Memphis, not just in Memphis, and seeks to tell the stories of this city. TheDailyMemphian.com. Truth in place.